Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm SATAKE from the NITS. So let me begin my presentation today. Together with great friends from the Indo-Pacific region being part to this panel this is a great honor for me. I'm going to talk about great power competition and Japan, and this is going to be my personal views. These are the 3 points I'd like to address to. The first one is, what is great power competition? What does it mean? The second point is whether competition, where this competition is heading for. New Cold War is the way people use this phrase to describe it, but where is this competition heading for? And the third point is Japan's response to great power competition, how it is responding, how it should respond. Now, let's address the first point. As we heard in the morning discussions, what this competition is all about. Of course, it is a multifaceted phenomenon. First is power, military and economic power. And another aspect is a competition over interests, of course, as well as values, ideologies are also competed for. So it is a very multifaceted phenomenon. And I understand that the international order itself, or the legitimacy of international order, is contested for in this competition. I understand that way because after the Cold War, the East-West confrontation ended. And based on human rights, democracy, rule of law, the so-called liberal international order seems to have become really universal. The United States and its allies emphasized meshing Russia and China into existing international order through multilateral institutions, human rights diplomacy, and free trade. Behind this was the expectation that once Russia and China are integrated into the international society, then, within their own countries, reforms such as democratization and market opening will progress in their own countries in parallel. This kind of a rosy expectation existed. And this kind of U.S. engagement policy seems to have been successful until the year 2000. Russia joined G8 back in 1998, and China joined WTO in 2001. And since 9/11, in the war on terror, China and Russia joined hands with the United States. However, this kind of a cooperative approach of China and Russia have gradually receded from mid to late 2000. China started reclamation in South China Sea and launched Band and Road Initiative, while Russia invaded Georgia and annexed Crimea, as well as intervened in the civil war in Syria. So they, respectively, started to challenge the existing order in Asia and Europe. After the United States left Afghanistan, China and Russia strengthened ties with the countries surrounding Afghanistan and also in the region around Japan. And that happened against the backdrop of rise of China and decline of the United States. The change in the international balance of power have been reflected onto the two countries' strategies. For example, since 2016, China have publicly claimed the superiority of its system and said China would never adopt Western political systems. Also, both Xi Jinping and Putin strengthened its own domestic system and strengthened surveillance of the people and the personal worship of the leaders. Also, via social media and economic assistance, China and Russia expanded influence over the so-called global South countries, such as countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. This expansion of influence of China and Russia happened and partly made possible by certain own goals by the Western countries and their loss of legitimacy. Populism rose in the United States and Europe, and the division and confusion over identity politics. We also saw it, as well as the Brexit, or the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan, leaving space for Taliban. Because of these events, freedom and democracy, the values which are the cornerstone of the Western international order, have been undermined. And it lost, and its appeal and legitimacy have been damaged substantially. And the Trump administration also disillusioned some people in China and Russia who, to a certain extent, admired those West-led international order. And more than that, Beijing and Moscow have engaged in disinformation and cyber attacks to exacerbate such confusion in Western countries. In February this year, Russia invaded Ukraine, and President Putin criticized the hypocrisy of U.S.-led global order. And he said the purpose of this military operation was not just to subjugate Ukraine, but was to reject and deny the U.S.-led liberal international order. He clearly declared this in his long speech. On the other hand, until the last minute, China denied the possibility of Russian aggression, and China also lost face because the aggression happened during the Paralympic it was hosting. But still, the China approved of Russia's military operations silently and also criticized the response from the West. Also, many countries in the global South criticized Russian invasion of Ukraine, but at the same time, when it comes to sanctions against Russia, they did not support those proposals. What does it mean? This means that the liberal order was not as universal as we thought in the Western countries. The United States realized this belatedly and finally scrapped the dream of integrating China and Russia into international order and decided to switch the gear and push back against China. Biden administration inherited very hard counter-China strategy from the Trump administration, and unlike Trump administration, now Biden administration emphasizes the coordination and cooperation with allies and partners. Also, it emphasizes the kind of dichotomy like a democracy versus authoritarianism to unite the allies and friendly countries. They are trying to re-establish a U.S.-led international order. Then, where are we heading for in this competition? This is a tricky question, and it is not easy to predict anything in the future. However, there are several key points we have to take note of. The first one is to what extent the Western unity and legitimacy can be maintained. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and Putin tries to overthrow the Western order, but ironically, that strengthened the unity of the Western countries. But on the other hand, the war in Ukraine is becoming more like an war of endurance. And in this situation, to what extent the Western countries can maintain their unity? That is a tricky question. In particular, Russia is the fifth largest trade partner for EU, and the sanctions against Russia has hit European countries more it did the United States. And most of the countries, most of G7 countries, including Japan, is facing a decreasing popularity of the government because of the prolonged inflation, and some countries have seen rise of radical populism. In the U.S. midterm election in November, the Democrats held out better than expected, but they also lost the House of Representatives, which will make it difficult for them to run the country going forward. If confusion in democracies continue this way, then the legitimacy of liberal international order will be shaken even more. In that sense, the true threat to the liberal society does not come from outside, but it comes from within. Now, if you turn the eye to China and Russia, they have heaps of problems as well. For example, as mentioned many times, China faces stagnant economic growth and the aging, fewer children, wealth disparity, excessive debt, and a corruption, also the radical zero-COVID policy, all of which could undermine the legitimacy of the Communist Party rule. Also, the middle-income trap is looming large for China. People used to say time is on China's side, but that might not be relevant anymore. At least some people are saying that way.
And also regarding Russia, war is prolonging, and because of the sanction by the West, economic growth is stagnating and unemployment is increasing. As was mentioned earlier by Professor Panda, or Arsge, that Russia may be withstanding. However, if Russia is detached from the global market as well as technology from the West, can they be sustainable? This is a question mark that we need to put on Russia. And also China and Russia, political system and economic systems, as well as culturally, they are so different. So it's not that they are monolithic. Of course, both countries are trying to put the end to the order led by the United States. However, violence as well as radical change of the current order is what Russia is trying to achieve. But China, of course, wants to use the force. However, want to use peaceful means through international organization or so-called gray zone activities so that gradual change in order can be achieved. So between Russia and China, approach of the two countries are relatively different. Now, regarding the universality of China model. Now, in the first place, regional countries accept support for China and Russia from the pragmatic standpoint. It's not that they are attracted by the systems of these two countries, and that's something we have to pay attention to. Of course, sovereign governance and advanced technology and mobilization of political capabilities, they are very much attractive by other countries than China. But would that be the only reason for China model to spread? The values as well as the legal systems based upon values need to be spreading in order for China model to be spreading. So we need to look at whether that is going to happen. Especially the characteristics of the China model is that for all the space and domain, everything is led by the Communist Party. In other words, China model is not separable from the Communist Party. Can other countries mimic that? I would say there is a big question mark. For example, in China, the excessive zero-COVID policy is being implemented, but can that be transplantable in other countries? Probably the answer would be no. And also, excessive debts and also China model with surveillance system would create resentment. In many countries, pro-China governments are being defeated through election. In other words, the order of West may not be as universal as we would want to wish. However, Chinese model is probably lacking universality more than Western order. And also Global South and other regions, they are not going to choose between China or the United States, but they would pursue a strategy to get the best benefit by having these two countries to compete, or hedging strategy, in other words. So based upon these understanding, the world is not dichotomic confrontation between democracy versus authoritarian, but rather the order of the or influence of the China and the U.S. would be different based upon issue by issue or domain by domain. In other words, the variegated order, according to the professor in Tokyo University, is going to be a very likely situation for the order going forward. Then, how Japan need to respond? Of course, Japan has been benefited from the liberal international order after the World War II. I think Japan is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the system. However, because until the invasion by Russia into Ukraine, I think Japan was a bystander of great power competition. For example, in 2018, there was a summit meeting between Japanese and Chinese Prime Minister. Xi Jinping and Japanese Prime Minister said that the relation between the two countries is agreed to be moving from competition to cooperation. This is reported to have been proposed by the Japanese side. Even if China and the U.S. are confrontations, but Japan has been maintaining its own relations with China. So this was a kind of calculation that the Japanese government was making vis-a-vis China, based up even against the backdrops of deepening confrontation between U.S. and China. And also same applies to relations with Russia. Prime Minister Abe met 29 times President Putin and to discuss various many issues. Of course, it was aimed to solve Northern Territory issues. However, if Russia and Japan can maintain a good relationship, maybe even if the territorial issue may not be solved, however, the two-front war can be prevented. Probably that was the strategic reasoning behind these numerous meetings with Russia. However, at the totally different level, China and Russia were collaborating with each other, and they are strengthening their joint activities and operations surrounding Japan. For example, after 2019, China and Russia's bombers were joint flying around Japan every year. And last year, in October, as you know, the China and Russia's fleet jointly sailed surrounding a Japanese archipelago. And also February this year, right before the Ukraine was invaded by Russia, the two people declared that the relationship between the two countries would have no limit. In other words, Japanese government not only able to prevent the dual front between China and Russia, but also had to prepare to face three-front crisis vis-a-vis China, Russia, and North Korea. So it was a wake-up call that Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. And that's why drones and bulletproof vests and financial supports were made to Ukraine together with the Western countries. And also vis-a-vis Russia, Japan joined sanction. And the Prime Minister Kishida said that today's Ukraine may be tomorrow's Asia. That was the statement when Prime Minister Kishida wanted to form solidarity with the Western countries across Pacific and Atlantic Ocean through G7 and NATO. If the Western order collapse, that would have a spillover effect over Asia, and that is a strong sense of crisis by the Japanese government. In other words, now we are feeling, or Japan is feeling, that we are no longer bystander, but one of the party to this great power competition. So under such situations, the Kishida government is now trying to have a fundamental reinforcement of the Japanese security capability and economic capability. Probably definition can be very difficult, but the gray zone used to be the level of threat. However, threat is now upgraded to higher end. And the idea of reinforcement of the fundamental capability of national security is to be more strategically autonomy, like a standoff missile is introduced, and also sustainability or resiliency enhancement of the capability is being discussed now. And also, in order to make fundamental reinforcement possible, 2% of the GDP spent on self-defense budget is being now discussed. Another thing I would like to point your attention to is the economic security. In a nutshell, to achieve national security, economic security should be achieved at the same time. And that is the idea behind this. This is quite interesting in that after the war for many years, Japan followed the so-called Yoshida Doctrine. In other words, for national security, we kept a low posture or low profile, while we put more emphasis and priority on the economic activities. And that was the doctrine and as well as the policy that we followed. And also separation of politics and economy was mentioned or used vis-a-vis China so that we can maintain relations. Low politics is politics and economics is high politics. That's what we say. But in Japan, economics is high politics and politics is low politics. And that has been the relations of Japan and China for many years. But because of the very difficult security environment, it is no longer possible to maintain such policy. In other words, economy might be put minor to national security in the future. In some cases, that could be the situation that Japan might have to face. Now, lastly, then how this competition can be managed? How managing this competition can be possible? The competition is just a means and not an end. And therefore, competition should not be the purpose of whatever we do. That's one thing. And also, containment is no longer possible, like we did in the Cold War era. Instead of trying to collapse the regime in China, but the competition vis-a-vis China will be trying to coexist. And of course, competition not only comes with negative factor of division or intensified confrontation, but there are positive factor. For example, we may have more regional unity if there is a competition somewhere around. And also in the underdeveloped countries, they can let China and Western countries to compete for infrastructure support so that they can benefit a lot from that. And also climate change and public health and also energy. This can be treated as public goods where everyone can benefit. So through inter-government or country-to-country competition, public goods provision may be promoted, and that can be a positive factor for the competition. So if that's the case, Japan has to do is to try maximizing the positive factor of the competition while minimizing as much as possible the negative factor of the competition. Quad or US-Japan alliance. Using these mechanisms, we are trying to reinforce network of alliance in the region. And also at the same time, we are trying to seek stable relations with China. In a summit meeting in November, there was a reference to the stable and constructive China-Japan relationship. There is agreement on maritime and aerial communication mechanism between China and Japan defense authorities, so the hotline has to start operation as soon as possible, and that was agreed upon as well. And also, Japan is trying to keep a certain distance from the Biden administration's democracy versus autocracy. For example, Japan is advocating for free and open Indo-Pacific Ocean. This doesn't really only focus on human rights and democracy, but also trying to have a more comprehensive order or inclusive order, including non-democratic countries. So managing a great power competition is one thing, but also risk management and coordination and collaboration, thinking about coexisting China, those efforts would be more important in the future. Now, lastly, the mechanism building for regional cooperation. In the era of superpower or power competition, we need to strengthen our collaboration with regional countries in terms of rulemaking and information sharing. For example, maybe we can do export control and the management of the export control with like-minded countries, and also we can have a framework to respond to economic cohesiveness of China together. And also vis-a-vis both the US and China, we need to have a mechanism in place to let them abuse a system of export system. And also in the future, it may be unexpected happening. So crisis management mechanism should be established, or maybe we should have a system to exchange important supply or essential supply when anything happens. Now, we have experts from the region on this matter. So Japan, India, the Philippines, and Australia, I hope these countries will cooperate with each other, and we would like to discuss with experts how best we can cooperate with each other. Thank you very much.